The U.S. monetary system is just about ready to get wiped out, and it's not going to happen because of some random financial phenomena or some unknown astronomical event. Our U.S. monetary system is going to crash because we violated just about every single one of God's economic laws, and the blessings of Abraham have run out. For a very short period of time that I attempted to play basketball in high school, one of the things I remember hating the most was wind sprints. You know, running back and forth from one side of the gym to the other. Each time you were forced to do it a little bit faster until finally you gave up or ran out of time. It reminded me of the last desperate actions of a panicked squirrel right before he got hit by a car. And the thing was, never at any time did you actually do a wind sprint during a game. If you did, people think you were crazy. It didn't help you shoot the ball better, dribble, pass. It was simply an exercise you did during practice. But unless you wanted the coach breathing down your neck during the next practice, you better do it as fast as you can when he ordered you to. Well, that's exactly how most Christians see God's law. Simply an exercise in obedience. There's no practical reason for all the rules in the Old Testament. It's not really going to help you out in life at all. It was simply an exercise to see how obedient you were. And when you pass the test, you're never actually going to have to do any of it in the future. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. Not only is the scripture clear that God's law will be kept and enforced in the kingdom, but God's law is extremely practical, and it prevents us from doing some really stupid things that we might not be aware of. The biblical health laws are a great example and are extremely practical and would have saved untold millions of lives if they'd actually been followed. Another very practical set of laws in God's Torah is God's economic laws. And when they aren't followed, it's a very easy and slippery slope for man to enslave ourselves through our own greed and scams of modern and ancient banking systems. Our world today is a prime example of a global economic house of cards ready to implode on itself because we've been willfully ignorant of these laws. And the United States specifically is on the verge of a complete financial collapse because of it. God's law is a lot like gravity. Whether or not you want it to acknowledge it is kind of irrelevant. You're still going to hit the bottom, and that's where we're heading. For instance, since the adoption of the Federal Reserve, the United States debt has risen 400,000%. Since 1970, our debt has gone up 8,000%. And when you compare that to our GDP, it doesn't look a whole lot better. Between the housing debacle of 2008 that we caused from retarded lending practices and the insane pandemic money handouts, we've indebted ourselves way more than it took to fight World War II. And that's based on our GDP, a very inflated GDP at that. Just from February of 2020 to today, just a few years, our federal national debt has risen 35%. And that's almost $100,000 owed for every man, woman, and child in the United States to pay back. How do you plan to pay back your $100,000, right? And that's not including $17 trillion in personal debt, $3 trillion for local and municipal debt, $1.5 trillion for state debt. We are by far the most indebted country in the world, with Great Britain a distant second with only a quarter of what we owe. And that's just in our debt. In addition to the money we borrowed during this insane spending spree, what we couldn't borrow, we just printed up. By the end of 2021, we were at the point where 80% of all money in circulation, we're talking about from 1776 to today, 80% had been printed up in those 2 years. And not surprising, the end result was inflation. And now, despite what the fake news might try and tell you, inflation is not an unknown weather phenomenon that randomly strikes people when you least expect it. It's not a disease that just breaks out and you never know why. It's caused by printing up trillions of dollars and paying people not to work. And because of that, our inflation rate went from 1.2% to 8% in 2022. And so what's the Federal Reserve solution? Raise interest rates. And this is coming from the same Einsteins that printed up the money in the first place. Well, despite what you might think, the government does not care that you have inflation. They don't care that you can't afford to buy food or heat your home. They don't care. What Fed Chairman Jerome Powell cares about is selling U.S. Treasury bonds. See, every year the U.S. government makes a budget. And that budget has nothing to do with how much money we make in taxes. We just spend what we want to spend. And when we run out of money, we either sell Treasury bonds or we print up money. And so with an 8% inflation rate caused by printing up too much money, printing up more money is only going to make it worse. And so with these recent bank failures, why doesn't Secretary Treasury Yellen just print up more money to bail out the banks? Well, it's not because she doesn't want to, it's because she can't. We can't print up any more money at this time. And so at this point, the only source of income after all the tax money has been spent is selling U.S. Treasury bonds. Well, nobody buys a U.S. Treasury bond with a 3% yield when inflation's at 8. They'd be losing almost 5% a year. And so what did we see? Bond sales collapsed at the end of 2021, right after inflation spiked. And so the Federal Reserve had no choice. They didn't do it because they cared about your cost of living. They did it so they could sell Treasury bonds. So they had no choice but to raise interest rates. And in the short term, it seemed to solve the problem. Bond sales went up, way up. Great. But now the big problem comes in, how do you now pay the interest on that debt? That the rate has now risen from 3% to almost 8%. And we're not talking about our old debt of 10 trillion or 20 trillion. It's 31 trillion now. And the interest rate just went from 3% to 8%. And so now those interest payments just went up 158% on that 31 trillion. In a very short period of time, we won't be able to afford the interest payments on the debt. Previously, it was about 9% of our federal annual budget was for interest. A year later, after all our spending, it rose to $480 billion, a 60% jump in 1 year. Now, by the end of 2023, with our interest rate raising, it is estimated to reach $730 billion. $840 billion by the end of 2024 if we hold that 7.75% rate. That's about the same amount of money we spend on our entire military budget. So what do we do at this point? Defund Social Security, Medicare, shut down the military, sell more bonds at an unsustainable rate, print up more money and watch inflation skyrocket, double the tax rate? I know, let's switch to a digital currency that has no set value. Well, at the end of the day, national bankruptcy is the only foreseeable outcome. So basically, greed, incompetence, and arrogance has put us in the situation where politicians print money to buy votes through taxes and inflation, take it from others, at the whole time thinking we can just kick the can down the road because we're never going to have to pay it back. Or better yet, our grandchildren have to pay for it. Well, guess what? We're now the grandchildren. Well, God's not ignorant of this problem. Human nature hasn't changed. The same greed and incompetence and arrogance that made the Soviet Union go bankrupt, the Roman Empire, Venezuela, kings of England. Multiple Chinese and Mongol dynasty issued paper money and printed it out until it was worthless. King Henry VIII, rather than cut back on spending, simply resorted to the old trick of issuing coins with less gold or silver than what was indicated on the face of the coin. In 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, allowing our central bank to basically do what King Henry did, create as much money as we wanted. And with an endless money supply, we can now lend out as much money as we want, when we want. It's awesome. Well, one thing we're going to see is that in the Bible, God was very much against banking. Central banks allow governments to lend out money that isn't theirs, diluting the money supply through printing money, exacting interest, causing inflation, all of which steals from the ordinary person. God is against all of it. Lending for interest, printing money, accumulative debt, and out-of-control taxes. Everything our financial system and government abuses on a regular basis. And so there are multiple statutes in the Torah that are very anti-banking. First of all, God is against charging interest. I don't know how many accounting classes you've taken, but banks live off interest-laden loans and loan origination fees. Get rid of these two scams and no more banks. Leviticus 25:36, you shall take no interest from him or additional profit. No fees, no interest. You shall fear the Lord your God so that your brother may live with you. So if you're thinking, well, I can't charge this poor bloke interest, but I can loan him food at a premium rate, right? With that loan, right? Sorry, that's illegal. Leviticus 25:37, you shall not give him silver on interest or loan him food for profit. You can't make profit off of lending money. You can sell it for a profit at the market, sure, no problem, but loans are to be interest-free and profit-free. Sorry, Banker Bob, you're not Torah observant. Deuteronomy 23:19 says, you shall not lend for interest to your brother, interest on silver, interest on food, interest on anything that is loaned on interest. So just in case you're still looking for a loophole, I'm pretty sure Moses has got all the bases covered with that scripture. No making money on loaning anything. Psalms 15 has some very specific blessings for those who don't charge interest. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor has given a bribe against the innocent, he who does such things shall never be moved, meaning you're going to be established forever. God's law requires that you lend to the poor, but not for a profit. Deuteronomy 15:7, if there's any poor amongst you within the gates that the Lord gives you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from the poor, your brother, but you shall open your hand wide and willingly lend to him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. See, the reason why God is so anti-loaning for profit is because lending money for profit is a major way of enslaving people. Just give desperate people loans they can't afford to pay back at exorbitant rates, and you pretty much own them. For instance, let's say you came across some poor guy who was hard up and something very bad was going to happen to him if he didn't have $2,000 right now. So as a concerned banker, of course, you're here to help him. No problem. I'm here for you. Here's your $2,000. I'm just going to charge you 10% compounded interest. Pay me back when you can. No problem. No hurry. Well, with some quick math, you can see that $2,000 at 10% interest for the first year will make you a modest profit of, say, $200. Not bad. In 10 short years, he now owes you $5,400. In 25 years, he now owes you $25,000. In 50 years, he owns $300,000. In 100 years, he owes you $42 million off of a $2,000 initial loan. Now, you may think to yourself, well, good luck on collecting $42 million from a dead guy. But what if laws allowed you to collect from his family? What if it was a national loan? You could go after the entire country. Well, as preposterous as this might sound, the United States has unpaid debts from World War II and before. As the U.S. Treasury bonds are rolled over, it is a compound loan. We are being enslaved by our debts, and we have enslaved others by their debts. Look what we've done to Africa.
America's never going to pay its debts. It doesn't have to. Its debts are in its own currency. We can simply print it. The African debt is not in its currency. The African debt is in U.S. dollars. Africa has to earn the U.S. dollars, and the only way it can earn the U.S. dollars is not to be assassinated for growing its own food and becoming independent and doing something that the United States does not like. The principle underlying the foundation of the World Bank is that no country should grow its own food. Africa and the Third World should only grow export crops. To export, in order to have an oversupply of cocoa and other tropical raw materials, to keep down the price, they must buy their grain from the United States or Europe, so that if they do something that we don't like, we can do what America tried to do to China in the 60s. We can sanction them. We can say, we're going to starve you. We're going to not export any grain to you. So owing their foreign debt in dollars means that they have to somehow sell something that the United States wants, not what they want. I think the most evil organizations in the world today are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
So as you can see, banks can easily enslave people through their loans. In our current situation of out-of-control inflation, the methods of the feds to lower inflation is to raise interest rates and tighten up lending. Now, why exactly would higher interest rates and less lending lower inflation? Because when banks lend out easy money, it causes inflation. Imagine you had to buy everything for cash. So you would have to save up money for years to buy a car, meaning if you haven't saved enough to buy your car, you can't buy it. So now demand goes down. But if a bank can loan you some money to buy something that you normally couldn't afford, demand goes up and so does the price of the car. And so does inflation. And when inflation goes up, it steals from your savings. Every day your money is now worth less. So why would you save money for 5 years to buy a car when every year your savings are worth, in this case, 7% less due to inflation? It would be better for you to borrow at a 7% rate, right? See, when the banks control the markets, it forces everyone to borrow and not to save. The banks win and you lose. That's why God is so anti-banking. God's law encourages us to save, not to borrow. A second principle of God's economic laws and why and how he is so anti-banking is through forced bankruptcy. He forces you to go bankrupt. So let's say you were a very crafty money changer in ancient Israel, a banker who found some creative loophole so you could loan to others and still make a profit from it. Well, God has another method to shut down banking, forced bankruptcy. That's right, forced bankruptcy. Every 7 years, everyone had all their personal loans and obligations wiped out. Whether it was a loan to buy something on times, money outright borrowed, indentured servitude to work off a debt, whatever. Every 7 years, these personal debts and obligations were all released. Deuteronomy 15:1. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Deuteronomy 11:2 and Jeremiah 34 shows that indentured servants were also released on the same year. The 7th year, they were to go out free and pay nothing. And so because you would have these planned bankruptcies every 7 years, instead of having these roller coaster boom bust cycles in the market like we have now, you would have these slight rises and falls in the economy that would slowly taper off, because the loans would only be good for 7 years. And as the 7th year approaches, investors would slowly pull back their money and cycles would be gradual and predictable. All loans would have to be short-term loans, 6 years or less, and this kept lending practices in check. Back on to Deuteronomy 15, it says, if there's any poor man of your brethren in any of the gates which the Lord is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor shut your hand from the poor. And there's a lot of other scriptures that talk about the need to lend to others. But verse 9, it says, lest beware, there's a wicked thought in your heart, saying the 7th year, the year of release is at hand. Behold, your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out against you, and it becomes a sin amongst you. So even though the 7th year was approaching, you were still supposed to help out those in need. It was a requirement of the law. And so as the money supply starts to get tightened up as the 7th year approaches, which would be natural, Elohim is warning the Hebrews to not forget the poor and needy. Yeshua Messiah echoes this all throughout the New Testament and in Luke 6, saying, lend to others, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward in heaven will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High. So once again, let's say you're a shady baker and you found a way to get around all these previous laws. Yahweh has one more law to put the kibosh on banking and financial enterprises, the 50-year Jubilee. The 50-year Jubilee was the nuclear bomb of all bankruptcies. Every 50 years, on the Day of Atonement, at the sound of the blowing of the ram's horn, a Jubilee was declared. Freedom was declared. All loans were canceled. Property was returned to their original owners. Slaves were freed. Obligations were canceled. It was the year of Jubilee. It was the year of freedom. This is described over in Leviticus 25. It says, you shall count 7 Sabbaths for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and at the time of the 7th Sabbath, you shall be 49 years. You shall blow the trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, to make the trumpet sound throughout your land. You shall consecrate the 50th year, proclaim liberty throughout all the land. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return his possession. Each one of you shall return to his family. It was a time of financial redemption, release, and freedom. And all of these statutes were designed to drastically limit banking before lending and debts get out of control like we have right now. For instance, do you have a home loan? Many of us do. Well, you know that friendly mortgage broker who loaned you the money to buy your house? He just brokered the loan. He probably doesn't even represent the bank that lent you the money. He then immediately sold that mortgage to another firm. Well, they bundled it up with a bunch of other loans into a big fund. And then some crafty guy realized they could make even more money if they divided up that fund into a bunch of little shares. They could sell those shares for a profit. It's called a mortgage-backed security. Doesn't that sound sophisticated, right? Well, then they started trading those shares like stocks on the open market. Then a couple years ago, SVB, you know that bank that just failed? They took $100 billion of depositors' money and bought a bunch of those shares. Well, the bank doesn't look at those securities like a 30-year investment like you do. They look at it as a stock whose value goes up and down every 5 seconds on the NASDAQ. And so guess what? Those securities the SVB bought right before the interest rates hiked by the Feds kicked in, they crashed, and now so did the bank. But the scams get better. Hold on. And what's awesome is these are legal scams. See, when SVB realizes their cash on hand is below what the regulators require, 10%, meaning 90% of your deposits aren't really there, they've been invested into a bunch of other junk securities. Well, when they fall below regulation, they simply go to another bank who's in the same bind as they are in, and they swap IOUs. That's right, Bank A gives Bank B an IOU and vice versa, say for $100 million. Now that $100 million they loan out goes on their liabilities, but the $100 million they get goes to their assets, and bam, they're back in regulation. All is good. Can you see how out of control things are getting? And can you see why God is against all of this? Because whether we're talking about trading mortgage-backed securities, trading bonds, options, fractional reserve banking, none of these actually create any wealth. No homes are actually being built. No food is being grown. Nothing is being manufactured. It's simply a way to make it easier to trade debt, get into debt, and spend money that nobody actually has. It's all a big fraud, or as some call it, chicanery.
For the EFT, Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the real retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
A third principle of biblical economics is standard weights and measures, and most important, a standard money supply. From the very beginning, God made it clear that in order to have free trade, you have to have standards and weights and measures. It's one of the few things that we sort of do to this day. Otherwise, when it comes to trade, it's going to go to a screeching halt. So you have to have consistent and honest trade. Deuteronomy 19, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in measures, weights, or in quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephod, and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall not have in your bag two types of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house two kinds of measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure you shall have, so that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord God gives you. For all who do such things, all who are dishonest, are an abomination to the Lord. We are to have honest and fair trading practices. And if you don't, God doesn't have a whole lot to want to do with you. These statutes are designed to reinforce the fact that you need standard measurements for fair and honest trade. And this makes perfect sense, right? Well, where there were extra protections was in the money supply. The most common form of payment in the Bible was the shekel. And at the temple, there was one shekel weight that was the public standard that anyone could compare their weights to. When they went in and gave an offering, they could compare it. This prevented disputes over weights of money and made sure money didn't get devaluated. Leviticus 27:25, all your valuations shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary, 20 gerahs to the shekel. And this is talked about in Numbers 7:25 and 85. And these statutes were in place to have a standard weight of currency and put it in the most public and accessible place at the temple to prevent the debasement of currency. Because you know, one trick that kings and emperors have done throughout history is when they mint coins, they either make them smaller, or they put just silver on the outside, or they use a really bad alloy instead of pure silver. Emperors of Rome frequently pulled this trick. Originally, the Roman denarius was pure silver, 4.5 grams. By the middle of the 3rd century, it only had 2% silver. Every time the Roman emperor needed a little extra cash, he just put less silver in the coins and pulled the other ones back. The Chinese and Mongolian emperors realized rather than constantly playing this game of pulling in old coins and replacing with debased coins, it's just much easier to just print up the money on paper. Well, we're doing the same thing here today, only on an insane level. Due to out of control inflation, the Fed has recently stopped quantitative easing. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what's quantitative easing? Well, in layman's term, it's called printing up money out of thin air. Well, increasing the amount of money in circulation has had the exact same effect as changing the units of weight to debase a currency. In 1968, the average household income was $7,000. Today, it's $70,000. Well, no one actually believes that we're 10 times richer than our parents. In reality, the government has simply devaluated our money supply by 90% in the last 55 years. A U.S. quarter in 1964 had about 1/5 of an ounce of silver. Since 1965, this amount has gotten less and less until now there's no silver in our coins. This is the exact same thing the Romans did. Printing up money, debasing coins, or changing weights on coins is just another way that governments have stolen and impoverished the working class. And Deuteronomy 25:16 is clear. All those who do such things, all who are dishonest, are an abomination to the Lord your God. They steal from everybody. They steal your savings through inflation and printing up money. A fourth principle of biblical economics is limited and very limited taxes. Many of the taxes we have today are hidden and we don't even know about it. Ronald Reagan, in a very famous speech, counted that there were 151 taxes on a loaf of bread. The farmer's got his property taxes, and then he's got his income tax and his gas tax and tax on the seed he buys and the tax on the water he uses to irrigate, and the list goes on. Well, he has no choice but to pass these taxes on to the consumer. So when the baker goes and buys the wheat from the farmer, he is now getting taxed. His property gets taxed. His electricity gets taxed on his employees. And the taxes just go on. And then when he hands the loaf of bread onto the store, now the store owner has all of their taxes. And the taxes just keep accumulating until you have 151 taxes on a loaf of bread. In God's law, there were offerings which were voluntary in amount. There were fines at times that you had to pay depending on how wealthy you were and what you did. And then there was a tithe of 10%. But keep in mind, this wasn't a 10% tax across the board on everything and everyone. Otherwise, it would just keep accumulating like the loaf of bread we talked about. Leviticus 27:30. All of the tithe of the land, whether it's the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is holy to the Lord's. And concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, whatever passes under the rod, 1/10 shall be holy to the Lord. See, the Levites were entitled to 10% of the initial produce of the land and the initial livestock production annually. But what you don't see is income tax on employee labor, income tax on the sale of produce at the market, income tax on the pottery maker or the blacksmith or on real estate transactions. There was only a 10% initial agriculture production tax, whether it was crops or livestock. That was it. If you have a government that can tax everything, the taxes just accumulate and pile up until you have 151 taxes on a loaf of bread. Taxes in the Bible were very limited. A fifth principle of God's economic system was decentralized charity. There are multiple statutes in the Torah and in the New Testament requiring you to help the poor and the needy. And a major characteristic of Christianity is compassion and charity. And there were numerous laws in the Torah enforcing this. Proverbs 11, the generous soul shall be made rich. All he who waters himself will be watered. Isaiah 58:10, if you extend your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall be dawn in the darkness, and your darkness shall be as the noonday. And there are a lot of other passages that talk about this in general, but others are more specific. For instance, Leviticus 23:22, it tells you that you are not to wholly reap the corners of your field or the edges of your field, and you're supposed to leave a percentage of your crops for the poor and for the stranger. Although there wasn't a specific measurement of the field, the principle remained that you were supposed to leave enough to provide for the poor. It was illegal to fully harvest your own field. And then in Deuteronomy 26, it was even more specific, requiring you to set aside a whole 10% of your produce every 3 years. Deuteronomy 26, when you finish paying all the tithe of your produce in the third year, which is the year of tithing, give it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow, so that they may eat within your towns and be filled. Notice that you were to give the 10% every 3 years to those in need within your towns, or as some translations state, within your gates. It was to be done locally. And one of the important principles here is that the individual was responsible to give to those in need. You were to provide for those who were around locally. This wasn't a situation where the government collected all the taxes and then they distributed the money to who they wanted to. No, you were responsible for giving to those you thought were most in need. And this was echoed again in Deuteronomy 15:11. You shall surely give to him. Your heart shall not be grieved when you give to them. For this thing, the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and all that you put your hand. For the poor will never cease. You shall open your hand wide to your brother, to the poor, the needy in your land. This welfare was to be distributed by the individual to those who were in need locally. This was not collected by the government for them to give out to people so that they would now be dependent on them. You were to decide who you were to give it to. Not the church, not the state, not some local government bureaucrat. You made the determination. It's your money. And if you decided you didn't want to give your welfare money to the town drunk or the local floozy, no matter how great their application looked, you didn't have to. One of the biggest failures of the American welfare system is that the government is completely unable to determine who needs assistance and who doesn't. And we inevitably end up encouraging the same bad habits that got people there in the first place. If you pay someone to sit on the street and do drugs, you're only going to get more people sitting on the street and doing drugs. If you give someone welfare determined solely by how many illegitimate children you have, you're only going to get more illegitimate children. Not less, only more. And that's exactly what we've done. It is said that if you buy something for yourself with your money, you are concerned about value. If you buy something for yourself with somebody else's money, well, now you're concerned about quality. If you buy something for someone else with your money, now you're concerned about price. But if you buy something for someone else with someone else's money, you don't care about value, price, or quality. And that's the government. And that's why we have so much waste. In the Bible, there were statutes mandating a degree of social welfare, but the individual directed where it went, not the government. Our modern monetary and social welfare and banking systems are in complete opposition to God's economic laws. Today we have out of control inflation, debt, spending, and a wasteful welfare system. And when this house of cards collapses, it isn't going to be because God is directly punishing us. It's cause and effect. Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever man sows, that he's also going to reap. And we are about to reap some horrific economic conditions because we've caused them, because we have willingly violated God's statutes and his law. God's law is not exercises in obedience. It's not like wind sprints during a basketball game. If you don't follow and diligently study God's law to understand what his intent by it and follow it, you're going to have nothing but failures, sorrows, and collapse. And unfortunately, that's what's heading towards the United States.